They say the past is an anchor and tradition is a weight. They've traded principles for power and substance for spectacle. They've embraced a movement of anger and personality. But to abandon the solid rock of principle is to occupy a house with no foundation. If you're looking for something different, for strength born of conviction rather than fury, to attach yourself to enduring truths rather than fleeting trends, to timeless ideas that transcend the outrage of the moment, you have finally found your home. Welcome to the Conservative Underground.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the first episode of the new Conservative Underground podcast. A lot of people who are going to be listening in today probably already know me and a little bit about my previous political and life experience. However, since this is also going to be published to various podcast hosting websites and applications, I'll go ahead and begin by introducing myself. My name is Justin Stapley. My background before I got more into political writing and political intellectual thought is actually more military and also law enforcement. I first joined the Army National Guard in 2008. I've had a combined total of 10 years of service. I did have a break in service, but returned. And then I also worked in law enforcement from 2015 to 2020. But I did have a background in American history. That was actually what I studied initially at Southern Utah University in the early 2010s. But I kind of expanded and began to question a lot more about political thought, political theory, what is actually conservatism, as kind of the political ground began shifting underneath us in a strange way all the way back in 2016. I kind of took a step back. At that time, obviously, I was still working with the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. But I, in my spare time and my free time, I began diving into the background of conservatism, political theory, as I mentioned before. Read lots of Locke, lots of Burke, discovered Frank Hayek, who continues to be one of my favorite conservative intellectuals, and really realized that what sets American conservatism apart is that it seeks to conserve what is a classically liberal tradition. Obviously, a lot of people misunderstand that term liberal, and it's not used in its original context very much. That can be maybe something I discuss at another time or another day. The way that FDR kind of took that term and twisted it towards something a little different. But I really began realizing and fully understanding the way that the rise of Trumpism, the rise of the various, labels we put on it, MAGA, America First, kind of wasn't just an aberration. It was a departure from conservatism. And that kind of is where I began my journey. I wrote a lot of kind of anonymous blogs there for a few years. Obviously, I was still in law enforcement. I didn't want to seem unprofessional. I was writing a blog called Never Tyranny through most of 2016. Its catchphrase was kind of never Trump, never Hillary, never tyranny. And then I shifted in 2017, and for a little bit, I was the Millennial Federalist. That's kind of when I first got really known among the non-Trump conservative community, because I was trying to really punctuate the moment to see if we could create more bipartisanship towards federalism. I think there was some success in that effort, but obviously I don't think the Democratic Party fully really embraced federalism until actually recently. That's something we could talk about another time, is the way that the overturning of Roe versus Wade has led the Democratic Party and the left to actually re-embrace a lot of federalism and state level actions. And then I wrote the Liberty Hawk, and that was actually where I was no longer anonymous. I was writing under my own name. I was publishing other people with that effort. There's actually a lot of excellent people that I'm still good friends with and still colleagues with that I first met with that Liberty Hawk effort. And that kind of lasted until maybe 2020. And that's the point when I really got serious about uh, conservative intellectualism, serious about political philosophy. I've been thinking about it long and hard for quite some time, and I decided to go ahead and leave law enforcement in 2020, and I returned to college. I'd heard about the excellent program in constitutional studies at Utah Valley University, and that's where I went ahead and was able to get accepted into. Graduated from that with my bachelor's in 2023. Um, and then I began studying for my master's degree in constitutional governance uh, last year in 2024. I've completed most of my coursework in that program, and I'm now just working on my thesis. I've also been involved in various other efforts. I've been very excited and pleased to be involved in the rise of the Reagan Caucus. It's really taken off across the whole country, and I'm the founding director of the Utah Reagan Caucus. Last year, we did uh, lots of efforts in endorsing and getting candidates over the finish line who we felt were more in the mold of Reagan, more traditional conservatives. Obviously, that has meant bearing the brunt of a lot of populist anger and hatred. And whenever we go to Republican events, you know, it's majority good experience. I have enjoyed really interacting with people who are looking for positive experience. But yeah, we face some vitriol. We face some really heated language, especially last year at the Utah GOP state convention. Um, there was a lot of the delegates that were very angry and very hostile toward our current governor, Governor Cox. You know, he was running for re-election last year, and we had endorsed Governor Cox, and that really ticked a lot of people off. And but it is what it is. Um, but yeah, so this podcast is kind of an extension of a Twitter X community. It had been named the Reagan Underground after a Twitter group that had been going on for quite some time. But when I got the idea to expand the effort into a podcast, into a newsletter, I felt like I should change the name um, just to kind of avoid, a cease and desist letter, when it comes to anything related to monetary, efforts. Um, but yeah, so that kind of is a quick down and dirty, brings up to speed of my background. Um, I wanted to talk today about populism, whether it's left or right. I have a flyer I like to hand out when I go to Republican Party gatherings when I'm doing some efforts with the Reagan Caucus, and it just asks at the top, is populism left or right? And then I kind of lay down some categories, and I have just progressive and conservative on each side. Um, and I'll make sure to share a copy of this at some point underneath the recording. But I kind of lay down, what progressivism tends to be about, what conservatism tends to be out, and then ask people to honestly consider where populism falls. Now, it is a little complicated. I kind of get in a debate on this issue a lot of times with people on social media. Populism is not an ideology. It doesn't really have to be about any specific doctrine or goals. It's really a political phenomenon. It's kind of like what you might consider as grassroots that's gotten a bit out of control. Populism tends to build up into an explosive movement when you have ordinary people who feel like the status quo is not serving their interests. Um, and they get angry. And a lot of times, eventually, what happens is you have demagogues who show up who kind of become uh, arbiters and avatars of the anxieties, the frustrations, and then it kind of explodes out from there. So first up, let's understand that, like, when I'm asking is populism left or right, that's a little bit of a misnomer because populism is not inherently necessarily anything ideological. So we're kind of specifically talking about this current populist movement. It's a right wing, as you might understand it, populist movement, and definitely the goals are right wing, right? I'm not saying that the goals aren't what we might consider right wing. Like, it's also a nationalist movement, um, but there's a big question, I argue, over whether or not the way that this populist movement is going about doing things, the way it is governing, is left or right. So let me just kind of start from the top. So um, progressives tend to be for economic planning, while conservatives tend to be for free markets. What is populism for? Populism, as we've seen so far, especially under the second Trump administration, is very much about economic planning. Donald Trump more or less has said on several occasions that he thinks of himself as a store owner or as the CEO of the country. And I mean, for example, tariffs. He's saying he issues tariffs so that people pay money to have access to the store, right? Um, and he engages in a lot of pen and phone governance. They're actually bragging about signing more executive orders than any other president at this point. Like, it's a bragging point for them, where traditional conservatism would be like, well, wait a minute, we don't want to have a president micromanaging the economy this way, right? So once again, so I think in this instance, it's very plain that populism is being a lot more like progressivism than conservatism. Okay, let's move down to the next item on the list. Progressivism tends to be at the rule of will. Conservatism tends to be more about the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is one of those ideas that's a little bit understood. A lot of people kind of misunderstand rule of law for the same thing as law and order. Little bit different. The rule of law is the idea that that we are governed by a legislature that passes laws. Those laws reflect the results of deliberation and consensus in that legislative branch, and then we are ruled by those laws. And this is important because the people need to have access to the representatives in the legislature so that they can have a redress for their grievances. Okay, that's the rule of law. The rule of will is arbitrary governance by a single person, by a small group of people, or by a large group of people that is not representative of all the people. And I mentioned pen and phone governance already. That is an example of the rule of will, right? When President Trump is issuing tariffs without any input from Congress, that is the rule of will, not the rule of law. When President Biden tried to forgive student debt without any input from Congress, that is the rule of will, not the rule of law. When President Obama went against what he had said before about whether or not some of his changes when it comes to immigration he could do on his own, and he ended up signing executive orders to change how our immigration system works, that was the rule of will and not the rule of law. Conservatism at its core is about the rule of law because at its core we're about the Constitution. So the rule of will is opposite of conservatism, and once again, judging by the rhetoric and the actions of the current populist movement, it is about the rule of will. Okay. We've already mentioned tariffs. That's the next thing on the list. Conservatives are for free trade. Progressives tend to be for government manipulation of trade. One of the reasons why America has been so tremendously successful across its history is because one of the first things that we did when we established our new country is that we got rid of all trade barriers between the new states. There were no tariffs for the flow of goods from state to state. And so what we essentially did is we created the first and the largest for a long time zone of free trade in world history. And that allowed America to thrive, right? Part of the American Revolution was about rebelling against the mercantilist policies of Great Britain. The Boston Tea Party was very much about the free trade of goods, right? The British government had established a monopoly. They said you can only buy tea from this company and you have to pay these taxes when they unload the tea. And you had all these patriots who are like, no, we don't like the government micromanaging our economy this way. This is not the correct way to do things. We want to be able to buy what we want to buy, and we don't want to pay taxes that we haven't voted on. The way that the populists, Trump and a lot of his supporters, have gone about arguing for the way that they want to involve themselves in the economy is a lot more like a return to mercantilism. Okay, it's a government manipulation of trade. It's saying we don't trust the free market to play out. We don't trust the invisible hand of capitalist investment, of what consumers like and don't like, of the ebb and flow and of a natural flowing economy. We need to have government come in and protect certain parts of the economy, right? That is a government manipulation of trade. Now, obviously, there have been tariffs in American history. The government has issued tariffs, but for different purposes and for different reasons. As I mentioned before, at the time that America was founded, we were essentially the only free trade zone. All of the other nations, especially the nations in Europe under monarchies, they had embraced mercantilism. And so there needed to be a little bit protectionism in order to protect the free market within our space. However, as we have grown, uh, we've been able to extend our free trade zone to more and more of the globe. We have extended the free market, and that has again benefited us immensely. One of the reasons why the 20th century was the American century was because of free trade. Because of the anxieties of populism, because of the concerns of these ideas that were being taken advantage of by other countries, has led to a denial of the way that free trade helps us. And honestly, the populist movement under Donald Trump is doing lots of damage to our economy, lots of damage to our growth. And we're taking down a lot of the rest of the world with us in the way that we're going about this. Okay. Moving on, I've already mentioned the Constitution. Conservatives are pro Constitution, progressivism tends to be post Constitution. And we can see evidence of this going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson was really the first openly hostile president to the constitutional order. He did not like the idea of limits on presidential authority. He didn't like checks and balances. He had this idea of the government and the people as being like a human body, and that it didn't make sense to have part of the body, the heart, working against another part of the body, the brain. He felt like they should work together. And so, in a lot of ways, President Wilson began kind of this march that has occurred on the left across the 20th century and into the 21st century of trying to establish a post-constitutional government, trying to get rid of these limits on executive authority, trying to make all the different branches of government work totally together as opposed to having those checks and balances, damaging the separation of powers between the federal and state governments. This has kind of been one of the legacies, honestly, of progressivism. Now we consider populism. which side does populism land on? Clearly, once again, it is post-constitutional. We've heard many populist activists come out and say that the Constitution shouldn't be a suicide pact, that we should, um, like the Constitution, admire the Constitution, but not let it govern us or rule us in how we go about doing things. We have to fight fire with fire. We can't be nice anymore. All these various things we hear populists say. And once again, in both Donald Trump's first and second administrations, we've seen this play out, right? We've already talked about the pen and phone governance, all of these executive orders. We have seen the way that Congress has essentially been relegated to a cursory role in how we are governed. It's like this announcement with Tylenol just recently. Um, we are very likely going to see in the coming weeks and months a new warning label on Tylenol in the stores that says this may cause autism or something similar. And think about the fact that that label is going to be showing up on our shelves without any input whatsoever from Congress. Someone in the executive branch made a decision without really any meaningful data to back it that this is going to happen, and then it's going to happen. To me, that is extremely post-constitutional because our laws, we mentioned earlier about the rule of law, our laws are supposed to come from Congress, from the people and their representatives. Okay. So next on the list is conservatives value republicanism, whereas progressives value a quote unquote tyranny of the majority. Okay. This is a basic misunderstanding of what democracy means in America. We are a democratic republic, and that means that we have democratic elements in how we decide who governs us. We have elections, we vote for representatives, we have an election, we vote for our president, and this happens at all levels of our government, right? That democratic aspect is a huge factor, important factor of our republic. However, we are a republic. That means that there are certain things the majority can't do. To paraphrase Kevin D. Williamson, something he loves to say is the Bill of Rights tells us what you morons can't do. um, when the Constitution says that we have freedom of speech, it is saying that the people cannot vote to get rid of freedom of speech. That is what it means to not have a tyranny of the majority. Okay. But what are we seeing right now from a lot of populist activists, from a lot of populist political figures? When the courts come down and release a ruling that says that something that President Trump did was not constitutional, we're hearing people say, how dare these unelected judges stand in the way of the will of the people? Don't they know that the president was elected by the people? That is a tyranny of the majority. That is a rejection of republicanism. Uh, I've come across the same thing in my efforts within the Republican Party. You'll have people say, we have to send a congressman to Washington who's going to support the president's agenda. And I'm like, okay, I can kind of understand what you're saying. I get the idea behind it, but we're not supposed to send representatives to Congress to be lackeys and rubber stamps for the president. We're supposed to send members of Congress to Washington, D.C. to represent each state's unique values and unique concerns. That's the way federalism works. That's the way a constitutional republic works. So, once again, populism, a rejection of republicanism, opposite of conservatism. Okay. The next one, very relevant to what's been going on lately. Okay. Conservatism is for pluralism, whereas progressives tend to be about cancel culture. Okay. For a long time in the last, say, decade, We have been laboring in a reality in this country where people have to watch what they say, lest they have attacks on social media, lest they have professional, private consequences. Um, I read just the other day about a young man who was goofing off and put on some sort of skin treatment and then took his picture, and that was that. And like a year later, this picture shows up again and starts making the rounds around his high school, and people are accusing him of being in blackface. And nobody didn't wait and listen for what the real story was. He was attacked. His personal life was so destroyed that his family had to move. I believe it was from California to Utah in order to start over again. And when he played uh, college sports, he had to live in fear that like this story from California where he had been canceled by his entire community was going to follow him and that it was going to cause him consequences in college. This was the cancel culture of the left that we had to deal with for a long time. There were actors who were losing jobs. You know, it was it was unacceptable. And the fact that this cancel culture existed was one of the reasons why Trump was able to come back into power. But now we're seeing this turned around, right? Instead of spiking the cannon of cancel culture, the populists are turning it around and pointing it back at the progressives. We've seen the situation with Jimmy Kimmel, and that's a whole situation in and of itself. I don't begrudge private institutions making decisions about their employees based on what they've said. At some point, an employee does represent their company, right? And companies have a right to make those decisions. But when you got the FCC getting involved, and you've got political figures, including the president himself, declaring victory at the idea that someone is no longer on the air, and then when they do come on the air, they're saying we're going to threaten lawsuits. I mean, we don't need cancel culture from either direction. So once again, this is showing how populism is mirroring progressivism. Okay. Next on the list, conservatism is about values and principles, whereas progressivism tends to be about soulless pragmatism. Okay. This was something I heard a lot back in the Obama years. It's something that has been around for a long time. It's this idea that, well, we're not ideological, we're simply for what works. We're not trying to be radical. We're just following policies that work. We're following what the experts say or whatever may have you. So like when they introduced Obamacare, even though a lot of us back then were saying, wait a minute, you are essentially pseudo nationalizing 1/5 of the economy. You're getting rid of free market forces in this huge, part of our nation. This seems kind of radical. It seems maybe even a little socialist, you know. But people are saying, no, 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 we're just for what works, right? And that's what I call soulless pragmatism. I think at some point you got to decide what it is you believe. You got to have some self awareness, or else you're going to be susceptible to creeping radicalism. And that's why I, as a conservative, am for values and principles. As a conservative scholar, as a conservative intellectual, I spent a lot of my time digging into what the first principles of free government are, right? I've spent a lot of time reading the Constitution, reading the Declaration of Independence, studying the Federalist Papers, reading the letters that the founding fathers sent back and forth to each other as that whole age was unfolding. And I did that because I really wanted to understand what the values and principles that establish our nation are, the ways that our nation has been successful when following those things, the times when we had troubles because we were abandoning those things. And to me, that's what conservatism is really about. This idea that there is a capital T truth and that we want to connect ourselves to that truth. We want to discover that truth, and that it's a truth that endures over time. It's not something that we abandon. looking at populism, once again, the ways that I've engaged with a lot of people that are on that populist coalition, they kind of reject this idea. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me, "Why are you talking about Reagan? Reagan is old. Reagan is outdated. You're attaching yourself to zombie Reaganism. Get with the times." And as this first began happening, I was really confused because I'm like, "Well, as conservatives, aren't we supposed to like believe that what is true yesterday is true today is true tomorrow?" I mean, obviously policies change, right? The way we apply values and principles changes, but the core, the root remains the same. And in a lot of ways, we began hearing some of the same ideas of soulless pragmatism being echoed on the right among the populists. You know, um, you're so stuck and determined to be part of your values and principles that you're letting the left steamroll over you. You have to be willing to fight on their own terms and do what needs to be done and embrace, whatever policies are necessary for victory. And in doing so, they've kind of lost this attachment to values and principles. So once again, populism, more like the left, more like progressivism, soulless pragmatism. Okay. Conservatism attaches itself to the broader American tradition of rugged individualism, right? One of Ronald Reagan's most famous quotes is that the most terrifying words in the English language is "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," right? Whereas progressivism, I remember back when Obama was saying, "Oh, government is just what we do together," and he had this whole "you didn't build that" moment, right? And progressivism just really believes that most good things in society flow from government as opposed to flowing up from individual ingenuity. What are we hearing from populists, right? We're seeing, you know, President Trump says, "I will be your retribution. I alone can fix it. Um, these policies are going to protect you. They're going to make the economy better. I'm going to go out and attack your opponents who are attacking me because they're only attacking me because they're trying to attack you," right? It's essentially government is here to help, is what I'm hearing from the Trumpists, from the populists, from all of these individuals. And that once again is counter to conservatism. It's more like progressivism. Okay. The next part, we've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but conservatism is for legislative preeminence and progressivism is for executive preeminence. Okay. So there's this thing that we talk about in political thought called the modern presidency, right? And it's this admission that sometime around the turn of the century, most of us kind of dial in on Theodore Roosevelt, though some people kind of talk a lot about Lincoln as well. But the modern presidency kind of unleashed itself in a way that hadn't been the case for the first 100 some odd years of the republic. Theodore Roosevelt used to talk about how, um, as the one person who was voted on by all the people, he is then the most representative individual in government. And to me, this is a corruption of the idea of representation. A single person does not have the capacity to represent all the people. We're too diverse, especially in a nation as big as ours. I mean, currently we're almost 350 million people. The idea that President Trump could represent all 350 million people just defies reality. In order to have representation, you have to have a representative body. You have to have a legislature. You have to have the ability of different states, different communities to send people to be involved in this institution who can represent their different views, their different desires, their needs, their wants, what have you. And then in the process of all of those different representatives deliberating, discussing, debating, and then voting, then we have representation. Then we have the will of the people. And that's the way the Constitution is written. The Constitution is written based on the idea of legislative preeminence. There's this idea that, oh, we're all co-equal branches. To an extent, yes, they're co-equal branches, but Congress was designed to be the first among equals. Okay. Congress was created by Article 1, the first article of the Constitution. And then the president was created in Article 2. I think that that was done on purpose. I think that was the framers saying that the will of the people flows from the legislature and the president executes the will of the people. That is, to me, the conservative view. Whereas the progressive view is, once again, this idea that the president should kind of be the leader of everything. And what a populists believe. I already mentioned earlier that President Trump sees himself as the CEO of the country. Now, a CEO may answer to a board of directors, but only in an advisory role, right? Um, President Trump and all of his business dealings has viewed himself as the man. I am in charge. You will execute my will. And that's how he's governed. He hasn't governed with a sense of what is the will of the people through Congress, right? In fact, he expects Congress to bend itself to his will. And that's being echoed among his most predominant followers. I mentioned earlier this idea that we have to send members of Congress to Washington, D.C. to support the president's agenda. We have to give Trump loyal members of Congress. That's not legislative preeminence. That's executive preeminence. That's attaching itself to what we call the imperial executive. Okay, the next part we've kind of talked about a little bit before, but no taxation without representation is the conservative view, whereas progressives tend to like pen and phone governance. Now, this kind of extends itself from my argument about representation, right? So the president cannot be a representative because he's one person, and one person can't represent the varied interests of 350 million people. Whereas Congress has a process that allows representation to occur. So when a president issues tariffs with no input from Congress, that is no taxation without representation. This is once again a huge demonstration, probably one of the biggest demonstrations of our time in the way that populism is more like progressivism than it is conservatism. They have given up on the commitment to the representative process, the representative process that the Constitution establishes and demands be followed. Taxation is what we call an Article 1 power, meaning that it was a power given to Congress. In fact, specifically, taxation and spending bills are supposed to originate in the House of Representatives. So not even the Senate is supposed to be introducing these things, because the House of Representatives is the most representative and everyone is reelected every 2 years. And so it allows the people to immediately respond if they've been taxed or if government spending goes beyond what the people want. And the fact that populists have embraced this idea that the president can arbitrarily do these things, once again, a huge demonstration that they're more like the left than they are the right. Okay, let's shift and talk about foreign policy. Okay, conservatism has long been in support of the idea that America is a city on a hill and that we maintain peace through strength. This is bread and butter Reaganism. This is what won the Cold War. Okay, this is what led Ronald Reagan to get reelected in 1984 with the support of 49 states. This idea that he resurrected the idea of America as a city on a hill, and that the best diplomatic policy is peace through strength. The left, on the other hand, going all the way back to the 60s, has really kind of embraced this idea of blaming America for the world's problems, right? You had the whole, peace and hippie movement in the 60s and 70s, which really kind of set the pace for the left the entire next 50 years. We saw this during the Iraq War. I mean, I remember before um, the first day of conflict had even concluded in Iraq, I was already seeing people wearing shirts that said Iraq is Arabic for Vietnam, right? Um, in fact, part of the journey I had of first becoming a conservative was seeing the way that the left turned on the war on terror just a few years after 9/11, and a lot of the rhetoric that they used just really bothered me, and it felt like a betrayal of patriotism. um, Obviously, I'm not saying you have to be in order to be a patriot you have to have supported the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan. What I'm saying is that the way that they were against it, right? um, Middle East is all messed up because it's America's fault, and if we engage more, we're going to make it worse, right? This is kind of a blame America first attitude. And then the same with the peace through strength. I remember when Obama was first elected, he went on what people called the apology tour, right? He toured the Middle East, and it seemed like he was just going everywhere apologizing, you know? And then he really seemed to step back and want to give the direction of world policy to these international institutions, the United Nations, um, and similar things. And he wanted to seem to have America take more of a back seat, right? Um, and you can see that approach to the way that Obama was dealing with Iran. He wanted to make a deal. He wanted to have diplomacy. He wanted to have peace at any cost. And in order to get this deal, he offered concessions that seemed pretty obvious to eventually lead to Iran getting a nuclear weapon. Okay, so this is how we kind of see foreign policy tend to play out on the left. This idea of blaming America first, leading from behind. Now, the track record is a little bit more muddy on this because uh, Trump is kind of a flavor of the day person when it comes to foreign policy, it seems like. Um, Most of his rhetoric, and it seems like his instincts, seem to be this same idea: blame America first, lead from behind, right? One of his big talking points is we're going to end endless wars, right? We're going to get us out of these forever wars. Um, the Afghanistan uh, collapse, the complete travesty that was began by Trump and then completed by Biden. Um, Trump almost abandoned the Kurds in Syria after we defeated ISIS, um, and sometimes he takes it even further than this idea of lead from behind. He doesn't want to lead at all, right? We kind of get this sense from Trump's rhetoric and from especially the more, what they call them, the restrainers or the isolationists that are in his cabinet and in his circle of advisors. They get this idea that what they want to see is a world that's divided up into kind of regions of influence, right? Let Russia do what they want to do in their area. Let China do what they want to do in their area. And then we can, talk about invading Greenland, talk about taking over Panama, talk about Canada becoming the 51st state, things like that. Now, once again, I said it was a bit muddy because every now and then Trump seems to kind of shift. And the next thing you know, he's saying and doing things in the very Reaganite way. We saw this just yesterday. All of a sudden, the president comes out with a tremendously pro-Ukraine message. We look at what happened in Iran, where all of a sudden he says, enough is enough. We're going to join Israel and we're going to get rid of Iran's nuclear capabilities. You know, we saw the same thing in his first administration when he decided to take out Soleimani. So this is a little bit more complicated because President Trump seems to kind of, it seems like people can convince him or maybe kind of guide him towards doing things that are a little bit more traditionally Republican. But I would point out that the instinct of his movement and the instinct of those who he surrounds himself with is very much blame America first and lead from behind. We hear it especially from J.D. Vance. Um, this idea that when America gets involved, the world suffers and America suffers. And to me, this is a complete abandonment of this idea of Pax Americana. The reality that if you look at the last half of the 20th century compared to the first half of the 20th century, we had tremendous peace compared to the world wars we had in the first half of the 20th century. And the big difference is that America filled that role of leadership. We established a commitment to sovereignty, to self self decision making by each different country. You know, we established that you do not get to conquer people anymore. And when you tried to do that, alliance of free nations is going to step in and create problems for you. And because of that, we avoided more world wars. We created, you know, I mean, you look at the peace that has prevailed in Europe before Russia invaded Ukraine, it's unprecedented in its history. You know, we tend to think of the Middle East as being this basket case of violence. But if you look at the history of Europe, 1945, and then proceeding backward for 1,000 years, it is just a torrent of bloodshed. And that was ended because of American leadership. So while I will confess that President Trump is a little squishy and a little back and forth on this, we can definitely see that the people who are going to be stepping in the wake of Donald Trump, the J.D. Vances of the world, for example, um, they are really embracing this blame America first and lead from behind attitude that is once again more progressive than conservatism, more left than right. Okay, so just a few more that we're going to talk about. Um, Conservatives believe that government protects liberty, whereas progressivism believe that government makes things fair. Okay, so a huge tentpole of progressivism is this focus on equality, on equity. Um, they will, you know, dive into the data. They will do studies. They will come out and say, "Hey, look, um, this government policy is having an unequal effect, or these individuals are less off than these individuals," and then they want to create government programs to fix it. You know, this is very much, you know, it began with the New Deal, but it really solidified itself under Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiative. You know, and it's what has created the modern welfare state, which the expenditures for the welfare state totally cloud over any other expenditure in government currently. Whereas conservatism has argued that there's only so much you can actually accomplish with government. There's kind of this idea among conservative intellectual history that government is very good at just a few things, a few very specific things, and that everything else it is terrible at. This was a huge part of Thomas Sowell's experience, for example. For those who don't know much about Sowell, he was actually very left wing in college. And when he graduated and went to actually work in the government, all of a sudden he was kind of confronted with the fact that this is not working. They've created these huge government apparatuses in order to try to help solve the problems of inequality, of the lack of equity in society. but it's not actually making any differences. It's not changing anything. It's simply empowering government to further mess with people's lives. And that's when he turned around and kind of discovered conservatism. Conservatism focuses on liberty. For the most part, your ordinary bread and butter conservative just wants to be left alone. They want to feel like they can live their life as they choose without the government interfering, without anybody telling them what they can or can't do, without having their food prices rise and fall with changes in policy, without seeing different ways of education and different things that are being taught in schools based on who's in power. That is the conservative impulse. So let's take a look at populism. Which one is it more like? We hear all the time from President Trump, all the time from various figures on the populist right, that this isn't fair. Things aren't fair. We're here to make things fair. And how are they going to do that? They're going to do it through government policy, right? Um, just look at the recent uh, lawsuits that President Trump keeps filing against media sources, right? This is unfair coverage. It's quote unquote 97% negative coverage, and that's unfair. And we're going to fix that by government action. We're going to come after you because you're not fair, right? That is not a conservative impulse. That is a leftist impulse. That is far more like progressivism. And that leads into my final part. Uh, there was a country music song that I liked a lot come out when I was younger, and part of the message is essentially "You do your thing, you do mine," and it's just one of my favorite songs. Um, and it's this idea that and the chorus says, "You worry about you, I'll worry about me. You can believe the way you want to, I can believe the way I want to." It's this basic idea about American society that believing something different is not an attack on anybody. As long as you are not interfering with other people's liberty, live out your liberty as much as you want. You do your thing, I'll do mine. And part of the ending chorus is um, I'm gonna keep on working hard, making money the old fashioned way. I don't need a piece of anybody else's pie. If I don't get my feel on life, I'm not going to blame anybody else but me. You do your thing, I'll do mine. Okay? That was the conservatism I grew up in. That was the message that was embraced by conservatism when I was a young adult. We just want to be left alone. We just want to be able to do my thing, want you to be able to do your thing, right? Now we can see that the left doesn't embrace this idea. Okay? We look at the way that um, you know if you don't make a cake for a gay wedding, if you don't allow your chapel to host a gay wedding, we're going to come after you, we're going to attack you, you're intolerant, right? But whether or I mean there are plenty of people who make cakes, there are plenty of places that can host weddings and wedding receptions. Why do you feel that your ability to exist in society is defined by whether or not you can force other people to accept you? And the left does this. It's what I call intolerance in the name of tolerance. Um, they kind of decide who should be accepted and who should be rejected, and then they go about attacking people, not only on social media, not only by protests, but also through actual governing policy. Right? You have the Little Sisters of the Poor, who do not believe in abortion, and they have been fighting a fight against the government for over a decade now because of Obamacare, trying to force them to provide abortion coverage in their insurance. That is the way that progressives tend to go about things. How is it with populism? Does populism embrace a you do your thing and I'll do mine effort? Or do they have a you will be made to care mentality? And I would say it's definitely the latter. Populists are definitely, once again, acting a lot more like progressives. They're acting a lot more like the left than the right. We are reaching that hour mark. I am going to wrap things up. Um, I posted on the comments that if anybody had any questions or comments, they could send a email to me. I don't see any emails yet, but please, folks, in the future, if you want to be a part of the conversation, if you have some questions, some thoughts, I know just just last week, um, I was on a roundtable, the Saving Elephants roundtable, and someone said something to the point like, "Oh, you should be more agreeable and not attack people," and both me and Josh Lewis were kind of like, "Huh." I wonder what that person was talking about. So if you have any questions, anything, always feel free. I'm going to do my best to try and host an episode at least every Wednesday at this time live. Um, Ideally, I will have guests. I wanted this first episode to just be me, so I can kind of introduce myself and then kind of, talk about some of the things I believe. But I'm definitely going to be trying to have more guests in the future. But thank you so much for listening. And as always, live free, my friends.
You've been listening to the Conservative Underground, the place for those seeking to renew the conservative movement and restore the Republican Party. Remember, the noise of anger and despair can be deafening. The headlines and the loudest voices may be full of rage. And those who want you to join them in their resentment and misery will tell you that the old causes are lost and the principles that have long defined us are dead. But truth always endures. The path to restoration and renewal always remains open. All that's needed are those with the courage to say, enough is enough. So join us. Become a steady and calm voice in the sea of outrage. Join our growing community on Twitter, X, and Facebook. Subscribe to the Conservative Underground on Substack or your favorite podcast application. Buy some swag from the Conservative Underground Fourth Wall store. Be a part of the groundswell of conservatives seeking a light in the darkness and a path out of the storm. Be principled, stay grounded, live free,